Okay, we may have a few more people trickling in here momentarily, but I think we'll go ahead and get started. So welcome again to the Jung Society of Austin and our presentation tonight on the stages of individuation and meditation from Daniel Whiteside. I'm Melinda Rothaus, and I'm on the board along with Joe Todd and Sandy Wilcox. And Daniel is also one of our board members, so we're delighted for his presentation tonight. Daniel is a mindfulness coach, mathematics educator, and small business owner here in Austin, Texas. He's a longtime meditator, and he's a student in the Mahamudra tradition of Buddhist meditation under the guidance of Dr. John Churchill. And what I love about Daniel's approach is that he really takes a scientific mindset and viewpoint and then kind of brings it together with the study of psychology and spirituality, which I find to be quite insightful and also grounding. So Daniel and I have done a lot of work together, and I'm delighted to hear his presentation tonight. I think you will all enjoy it. So I will turn it over to Daniel.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction, Melinda. Hey everyone, I'm Daniel, the aforementioned speaker. I'm also kind of managing the Zoom room right now, so if I look away occasionally, I'm dealing with people in the waiting room, so just bear with me. I'm going to go ahead and start. I have a PowerPoint, so you guys let me know if you can see this when I start sharing it. Can everyone see that? Thumbs ups. Okay. Now let me just adjust my view so I can attempt to see all of you while we're doing the PowerPoint. I'll try my best here. Don't normally do slides, so. Okay. We're basically ready. Well, I had a slide prepared for who am I. However, Melinda's done a very gracious introduction, so I don't need to tell you who I am. But I will tell you a few things about how I got here, a little bit of my story. And it kind of starts out in engineering school. I was attending a very good engineering college. I was studying electrical engineering. And I started to kind of have a bit of an existential crisis my freshman year of college. I was kind of, I was carrying around this physics textbook everywhere and studying it, and I was absolutely fascinated by physics and engineering and building things and quantum mechanics, especially kind of this more esoteric version of physics. Like my mind loved that kind of problem. And I've always loved that kind of problem. I still do. But one day I was sitting in my dorm listening to Richard Feynman, who he's dead now, but he's he's a world famous physicist and engineer and worked on the Manhattan Project. And I was sitting in my dorm room listening to him talk about working on the Manhattan Project, where they were building the atom bomb. And he said something about the engineers at the Manhattan Project realized before it happened that Germany was going to lose the war, but they didn't stop building the nuclear bomb. And when I heard this was kind of like a nuclear bomb in my head, because I was so obsessed, I was so committed to physics and engineering that it kind of like rocked my world. I basically just had this realization that, you know, even some of the smartest people in the world didn't have the wisdom, basically, to stop doing what they were doing. So this was kind of a turning point for me, and I think this is really when I decided, kind of perhaps unconsciously, but that I was no longer fully committed to being an engineer or studying physics. And I still, like today, I still teach math. I still really love physics and thinking about it, but I would say it's not my priority. You know, it's not my life mission to understand this or to bring that closer to the world. Shortly after that, I encountered my first psychedelic experience. Uh, and this was probably the nail in the coffin. Um, I had this crazy experience. I was a complete materialist. Like I said, I had been studying math and physics. I was a very analytical person my entire life. And I took a psychedelic compound, and in one day, all of that seemed completely meaningless. It was like I had woken up from a dream, or realized that I had been living inside of a dream or something. If you want to hear more about that, I think my mom is on this call, and unfortunately, she had to witness that. The external circumstances of that psychedelic trip were, externally, it was the worst day of my life. I had to go to the hospital. I was sedated. I was handcuffed to the gurney. All kinds of, you wouldn't believe it. But what was happening inside my mind was like the most beautiful, the most transcendent, the most amazing thing that's ever happened to me. And so when I woke up the next morning, I realized immediately that nothing in my life would ever be the same. Basically, I had to reevaluate everything, including my life purpose. So, and I'll tell you more about that as we go along, I suspect. But needless to say that these kind of mystical psychedelic experiences have a profound impact on psychology and development, and that's part of the reason that I'm here. So after that experience, it must have been within a couple of days, I found Alan Watts. He's kind of a hybrid, he's a psychologist, philosopher, existentialist, Zen Buddhist practitioner, and I just kind of found some lectures and books that he wrote, and that's how I really got into meditation. And I kind of floundered with that for a few years, trying to figure it out on my own. I think I was a little bit arrogant. In high school and college, I taught myself calculus. I taught myself how to play piano, but this meditation thing was so far outside of the domain that I was comfortable with that I didn't know what I was doing, basically. So I floundered for a while until I found a good teacher. But let's see. Why am I telling you this? The reason I think meditation and individuation are important, and the reason I'm giving this talk, is because these kinds of practices can help us recognize the ways in which we deceive ourselves, the ways in which we bullshit ourselves, and they help us break out of reference frames that perhaps we didn't even know that we were stuck inside of. So I find this stuff extremely potent. And I guess if you like what I'm saying, I'm a living example, or if you don't, then maybe it's proof that you don't want anything to do with this stuff. However, so psychedelics, meditation, and studying Carl Jung's work, this path of individuation, has been basically my primary intellectual interest for about the past decade, since 2012, when all this stuff started happening. So let's talk a little bit about, I'm using a unique term here, but psycho-spiritual development. So we're kind of combining psychology and spirituality here. I think Jung would be okay with that. He was definitely kind of in the in-between space, in that mandorla, the piece in the middle of the Venn diagram between psychology and spirituality. And since you guys can read, I will not read you quotes, but again, I'll repeat this. We're kind of, if we're partaking in one of these paths or one of these programs, we are fundamentally working on our capacity, or understanding our capacity for self-deception, our capacity to bullshit ourselves, and learning to take new perspectives. So that's really what this psycho-spiritual growth is about taking new perspectives and kind of opening back up to experience. The reason this is necessary is I think it's part of human nature that when we're children and becoming adolescents, that we kind of learn a specific way to be. We submit ourselves to get kind of culturally programmed, if you will, using a euphemism here, but we socialize ourselves, we grow up, and then we take a specific view of the world. And that would be fine if the world was always the same all the time. But since the world is always changing, we have to also be willing to give up that viewpoint, give up our frame of reference, and adopt a new one when necessary. And I would say that this whole path of development, this whole paradigm, has roots in Greek philosophy, going all the way back to Plato, Socrates, and Aristotle, who were trying to figure out, well, if you recall Plato's metaphor of the cave, right? That the mass of humanity is living inside a cave, and we can just see the shadows of the light entering the cave. And Plato wanted us to escape the cave. And the cave is that reference frame that we can't break out of. And leaving the cave is some kind of enlightenment, or seeing what's really going on in the world. So I think all of this is tied to philosophy. It's tied to Buddhism and shamanism. This paradigm, this idea of growth and development, taking new perspectives, goes all the way back to the dawn of culture and to the dawn of history. So it's not just me. And in case anyone was wondering, this is a painting by William Blake. And this is a depiction of Jacob's dream from Genesis chapter 28. He has a dream that a stairway ascending to heaven opens up. And so this is, metaphorically, symbolically, what we're trying to do. We're trying to get to that state of higher awareness, higher consciousness, heaven, nirvana, whatever you want to call it. We're trying to make some kind of ascent up the mountain, up the staircase. So we're going to talk about our first model of human development that I am most familiar with. And this is called spiral dynamics. And I think this is a beautiful depiction of, or one version of, individuation. And this was started by a psychologist in the 1960s named Clare Graves. And he had a theory about this. Basically, how it started was he just interviewed like thousands and thousands of undergraduate and graduate students at his university, and basically just asked them, what do you value? What is important to you? What do you believe in? What would you be willing to take a risk for? What's most important to you? And he found out that, analyzing the language patterns of thousands and thousands of people, that you could more or less sort people into discrete categories of belief systems. And so he kind of constructed this hierarchy, or this staircase, if you will, of various belief systems. So I'll just let you look at it for a second, but it's organized, each one is assigned a color. And it starts at the bottom with one of the lowest forms of consciousness, the lowest one on this map. It starts with this kind of tribal, mystical thinking. Maybe I should say, this is a model of how people's belief systems evolve, but you could also equally apply this to any entity that is living and intelligent, including like a company, a culture, a tribe, a nation, perhaps even the whole planet, all of human consciousness. But starting at the bottom, we have this kind of mentality of tribalism, and then societies tend to evolve into a more authoritarian or totalitarian monarchy or an empire. Later in history, or later in your personal development, You start to take on an ethnocentric or kind of this nationalist belief system. And then when we get to orange, people start believing in more more altruistic behaviors, more altruistic belief systems like democracy, capitalism, neoliberalism, libertarianism, the free market, laissez-faire. This is basically stage orange is like enlightenment values coming straight out of enlightenment philosophy. And then we go to green, yellow, and then all the way up to turquoise. And these are kind of like stacked levels of human development, human growth, or value systems, depending on the way you look at it. Maybe what I'll do is I'll show you a couple of other models. First of all, does any of this make sense, or am I completely missing the boat here? Does everyone understand what I'm talking about? I'm getting some nods. Okay. Great. Okay, so we've got spiral dynamics. This was Claire Graves, Beck and Cohen's kind of founded or discovered, invented, whatever you want to call it, in the 1960s. The latest version of this is quite a bit more complicated, but I'm just going to show you the picture. This is called the stages matrix by a researcher called Terry O'Fallon. I believe she's located in Colorado. And I would say the most important part of this diagram is this column on the left. Is the object of awareness concrete, subtle, or meta-aware? This is really the meat of this theory, is that there's basically 3 tiers of cognitive development or cognitive awareness. And again, an individual human being will pass through these stages in a sequence of development. And if you look at the course of history, countries, nations, city-states, political bodies also tend to evolve in a similar way down this spectrum. And again, if we switch back to this one, you might be able to tell that each one basically transcends and includes the previous levels. So as you move higher up the hierarchy, you're basically increasing your capacity to take a more broad perspective on reality or on yourself. So these lower stages down here, purple, red, and blue, you typically see these in rather primitive societies. Although if you read about red and blue, it might be clear that we're still dealing with some of that, on this planet right now. And when you get up to orange and green, probably if you're an average American, the orange and green values seem correct. They seem right. Whereas the blue, red, and purple value systems may seem archaic or even disgusting, right? We kind of, every stage in this model hates all of the other stages. They think they're wrong. And they have perfectly logical and rational arguments to prove that. So this is kind of interesting, and especially now that we live in a global society, we basically have people, organizations, and countries existing at all of these levels simultaneously. If we lived in the 1600s and we found a society that was operating at a different level or had a different value system, we could just wipe them out. We could just kill them all and say, well, it doesn't matter because we were right. But it's becoming more and more obvious that we cannot do that anymore. It's just not in the cards for us. We have to come up with a different way for all of us to get along than brutal murder. So that's kind of where we're at today. That's what it seems like to me. Admittedly, I'm probably at one of these stages, so I'm also I have a perspective on the world. So that's helpful to note. And you might notice that you might have a perspective too. If you look at these, you might see one of these stages or colors that you agree with more than the other ones. Or maybe if you're a narcissist, you just think you're at the highest one already and everyone else is beneath you. There's all kinds of interesting mental games you can play with this graph here. I see there's a question. Oh, it's from my mom. Do you know how to unmute yourself?
I was just going to tell you, we're on 2 devices. Can you let us in on the other one as well?
Oh, I absolutely can. Okay, folks, I'm going to stop sharing for 1 second. Oh, there's 4 people waiting. Thank you for letting me know. Okay. Are we back to the PowerPoint? Yes. Okay. Okay. So, and we've already looked at this one. Screenshot this if you want. I can send it to you later. It's rather complicated, but if you're interested in this kind of the cutting edge of this developmental theory stuff, it's Terry O'Fallon, and this is called Stages, the Stages Matrix. It's kind of an interesting way of looking at development. The most important for this is that the first tier. Maybe we should talk a bit about the object of awareness, because that's very abstract and kind of like a Buddhist term, but the object of awareness.
Recording in progress.
That was strange. Okay, so when we're at the concrete tier, basically we can only comprehend things that are like physical, like real objects. So you could think of this like in an early stage of child development, like that object impermanence thing, when you can't see your face anymore, the baby genuinely believes that the face no longer exists in the universe. So this is kind of very concrete thinking. We can only see things that are right in front of us, that are solid, real, material objects. Later in development, children or young adults start to have an awareness of what is called subtle objects. And subtle objects are emotions.
We're getting a little bit of echo. Can everybody make sure to mute besides Daniel?
Thank you, guys. I'm still hearing a little bit, but yeah, make sure you're muted. Okay, so as our awareness kind of evolves into these 3.5, 4, 4.5 stages, we're able to take on we can process different kinds of information. We can perceive different kinds of objects, and they're calling this a subtle object of awareness, because it's not a concrete object like a coffee cup or a telephone. But people at the subtle level can start to recognize abstract principles like freedom, patriotism, love, anxiety, fear, panic, right? Like kind of not so obvious object. They're not exactly objects really, but they are objects in our awareness, because we can kind of wrap our mind around them. We can process them. We can look at them from different angles. So it's a thing that we can think about that is not a concrete object. And then when you get to the meta-aware tier, which I think the estimates on this is like less than 5% of the population. It's typically very highly educated, highly trained people. Although I will say education does not equal higher awareness necessarily. Just because you have a PhD doesn't make you at stage 5, but the meta-aware tier basically is when your cognition has developed to the point where you start to become aware that the mind constructs experience. And this is a bit of a challenge to talk about unless you know what I'm talking about. But this falls in line with Jungian theory, because we're going to start to talk about projections, and another word for projection is a construction, right? It's like parts of our experience that are basically created by the mind, entirely by the mind. And so in some sense, we're kind of living inside of a mental construct. And starting at stage 5, you start to become aware of that. Like, you start to become aware how much or to what depth your mind is actually creating the experience. We're not necessarily observing things exactly as they are in the world. So we'll move on. Here's just like a graph of comparison. So we've got spiral dynamics at the top, and then we've got this. The second row is actually Claire Graves' original naming scheme for the model. So he didn't assign them colors, that came later, but he called them archaic, magic, mythic, rational, postmodern, integral, mystical, non-dual. And again, these are just various value systems or ways of seeing the world. A person at the magical level or at the purple level is going to believe in ghosts. They believe in all kinds of magical, mythical things. They believe in witches and shamans and magicians, right? And of course, there's people now that believe that stuff, and that's why this model the kind of the catchphrase I'm using is transcend and include. So every time you go up a stage, you're not leaving anything out, but you're able to take that perspective that you could already take and a new one that's a little bigger. So. And then this third line here is a theorist named, oh gosh, what is his first name? His name is Kohlberg, Lawrence Kohlberg. And this is one of the easiest models to understand, but he was kind of working along the same lines. He was trying to figure out how do people develop, and then of course, how can we foster that process? How can we get people through these stages faster or as quickly as possible? But he only recognized 4 stages. And so in some senses, this one's very easy to understand. And you can see this alive and well in the world today, right? There are whole societies, and there are individuals that operate from an egocentric level. And then there are people who operate from an ethnocentric level, a nation-centric level. And then there's people who can take the whole world into perspective, right? They have a world-centric, kind of this globalist view. And then beyond that is cosmocentric, contemplating the entire cosmos at once. And then this last row is actually Jean Piaget. He was a child psychologist, and he was also extremely interested in development, particularly in his case with children. So his stages are named kind of in a funny way, but this reflects his experience of working with children. The sensory motor stage, the emotional stage, the conventional operational stage, formal operational, and post-formal. Now there's also 3 tacked on here to the end that Piaget did not recognize. And I'm having trouble remembering who extended this theory. But this is another theory about how people develop. I think one very important thing about all of these stages is to recognize that basically people at different stages, they think in different ways. They have a different mode of thinking. And so if we go all the way back to like a philosopher like Rousseau, he was the guy that kind of was the proponent of the blank slate theory, and he was also a child psychologist, and he basically believed that children were exactly the same as adults. The mind was the same. They just didn't have this and as much information, which made them appear to make these silly mistakes. Like if you take a tall, skinny glass of liquid and pour it into a short, fat glass, and you ask a kid at this sensory motor stage, well, which glass had more water? They're going to pick the one that's skinny and tall because they haven't yet learned the concept of conservation of mass. And so people like Rousseau, people who believed in this blank slate theory, thought that they were just missing a piece of information, but Piaget kind of totally changed that. And he really believed that children at these different stages actually thought differently. There was something structurally different in their thinking process. It wasn't just that they were missing a piece of information or were ignorant of something, but they actually saw the world from a different perspective. So I think this is important, and it might make it seem more of a challenge about how to deal with global politics, basically, because you can't just argue rationally with people at a different stage, because they have a different value system, they have a different perspective. It's not that they weren't aware of a piece of information that you were aware of. If it was, you could just tell them, and then you would both agree. But actually, people at different stages see the world in a different way. They process information in a different way, and that turns out to be critically important. So, okay. So what I want to do right now, we're going to shift gears a little bit, but first I want to do a little meditation, a little contemplation. It's going to be about all these different stages. So just set yourself up with a comfortable posture. You don't need to necessarily look at the screen for the next couple of minutes, and I'll tell you when we're done. And if you're into like Buddhist meditation, this is a little different. This is more of a contemplation. So we're going to be using our cognitive faculties here. But we're going to be looking at basically this third row, Kohlberg's stages of moral development. There's only 4. So there's egocentric, ethnocentric, world-centric, and cosmocentric. By the way, ethnocentric seems to be somewhat of a bad word, right? But if you're really listening to what I'm saying, ethnocentric is its own unique stage of development, and it's its own perspective. You don't get to skip that stage. In fact, probably every single one of us at some point in our life had this ethnocentric perspective. Maybe it was when we were a little kid or something, right? But there was this huge concern about, who's in the in group and who's in the out group. And this is ethnocentric thinking. And everyone does it. So there's no escaping it. But okay, so set up your meditation posture. Maybe just let your eyes relax a little bit, close a little bit, clear your mind for some deep thoughts, for some deep thinking. And I want you to basically just try to identify someone that you know, or maybe even a famous figure, someone you don't know personally, but someone who's primarily operating out of an egocentric level of development. It's easy to think of a child because that's natural, but there's plenty of adults that are like that too. So you can probably think of at least one. We're going to do this for all 4. But see if you can see the value in this perspective. What is the person getting out of believing this worldview? This egocentric perspective. It's all about me. It's all about survival. It's about protection. Perhaps a duty to the family, the tribal unit. But what is the true value in this perspective? What kind of needs does it satisfy? Everyone has the same needs. We might have different beliefs on the surface. We might have a different perspective. But we have a belief system because of a set of universal human needs. So what is this person at egocentric level? What are they trying to get? What needs are they trying to meet? And see if we can view that with understanding, with compassion. Everyone is at the exact stage that they're supposed to be at this moment in time. You can think of it like a video game, right? You don't get to go to the next level until you've mastered this level. So anyone who's at egocentric, they're not quite ready to go to the next one, or they would. And then this might be a little easier, but also think about what this perspective might be missing. What do they fail to take into account that maybe one of us at a different stage can see clearly, but this person at egocentric, they have no idea, can't figure it out, they're missing something. This person who's wrapped up with their own survival, their own protection, their own pleasure, their own pain. What are they missing? And then maybe since we're a spiritual community, we can all imagine ourselves kind of huddled around this person, just sending love to them, understanding why they are at the stage that they're at. Letting go of any blame or judgment or attempt to hold them responsible or force them to grow. Just try and release all of that. And then let's do this again with the ethnocentric level. Let's try and think of a person, could be an entire country, a civilization. What is the value? What's good about the ethnocentric perspective? What does it protect against? What is it a strategy for? What human needs does it satisfy? Person at ethnocentric definitely wants strong borders, right? They want to know clearly, where's the boundary? What is mine? What is not mine? What is ours? What is theirs? Who are the good people and who are the outsiders? You have to put yourself into their shoes a little bit to figure out, like, what is it? What human need is it that they are satisfying by taking this perspective? Could just be a reaction against the previous stage, protecting the group against an egocentric individual, perhaps. I don't know. But if you can see the value, then let's see if we can love this person for whatever stage they're at. It's totally fine. Just like, how tall are you? It's like, is that a moral question? No. It just is what it is. And then let's just contemplate a person or a civilization at ethnocentric. What are they leaving out? What are they forgetting? Or what might catalyze their growth to the next stage? Why bother evolving from ethnocentric to world-centric? What am I forgetting if I stay at ethnocentric? And let's do the same thing for world-centric. See if we can identify a person, a company, an organization, a civilization that is operating at this global world-centric perspective. And you might notice as we move the needle to where you're at, you're going to start to agree more and more with the naming of the stage, with the position it takes, the things that it believes. You know, it just sounds more correct to you. Maybe take a note of that. But a person or entity at this world-centric level of development, what's the value in that? What human needs is that satisfying? What is it protecting against? What is it improving or making better? And then, of course, this person at the world-centric perspective, what are they missing? What are they forgetting? What do they lose sight of? I suspect each one of these perspectives has multiple blind spots. So even someone who sits around thinking about how do we get the whole planet into alignment, they're missing something. Otherwise, we'd already have the utopia, right? So the world-centric people have to be flawed at least a little bit, at least 0.001%. And then finally, let's move on to this cosmocentric. Just think of someone who is at the cosmocentric level. Could be a particular individual. In fact, it might even be a fictional character. Like sometimes when we get to these higher stages, people start thinking about the Buddha or Jesus, or this kind of like an archetypal self instead of a real person. Think about someone at this stage and see what is the value in this stage. What human needs is this satisfying? What do we get out of it? Extending love and compassion to this person too, no matter what stage of growth that they're at, no matter where on the spectrum they are. And then maybe think about what is the cosmocentric perspective missing? What is left out, or what is not yet accomplished from this perspective? And since we're basically at the end of the meditation, I can tell you for sure the people who get up here at these higher stages, they tend to forget the lower stages. They tend to ignore them. And you can see this in global politics today. We have people at stages green and yellow who are kind of world-centric, borderline cosmocentric. They're very integral thinking, but they underestimate these people at purple and red. Religious extremism, people who want to people who absolutely want to wipe out the other guys. And we're up here at green and yellow thinking, oh, it's all groovy. Like we've got high-tech society, we've got all kinds of progress going on. We can just forget about this stuff, but they didn't forget about you. So, okay, I think I might pause there. We're about to transition to something a little different. So I wanted to see if anyone had any questions or comments, reflections on the meditation even. If anyone wanted to share their answers, I'd love to hear it. Like these questions I was asking about these different stages, I really am curious as to what are the human needs that are being satisfied, and what are these perspectives leaving out. So if anyone has any insights or things that they thought of, I'd love to hear it. And I can't see if anyone's raising their hand. So honor system, but just unmute yourself. John, yeah, hey.
Yeah, Daniel, I would just say that second line down from the top reminds me more of John Gebser's concept of stages of consciousness. Are you familiar with John Gebser?
I don't know the name. How do you spell that?
Gebser.
Gebser.
Geb- His most famous book is called The Ever-Present Origin. And I learned about him through Ken Wilber's writings, actually.
Okay, yeah.
John Gebser is that book called The Ever-Present Origin is an amazing book that explains all of those stages in that second line down from the top.
Okay, okay.
And the ability of him to, along with Carl Jung, John Gebser was one of the most educated, well-read men I've ever come across in my life.
Wow.
I recommend him highly.
Wonderful. I wrote it down, and it is, I'll look into it. It's possible there's some overlap, or possible that you're right and I'm misreading this chart as Claire Graves' model. But yeah, thanks for sharing. Appreciate it.
Yeah, that's more of the John Gebser model, that second line down.
Okay, okay. Well, I'll definitely look into that. Always more to research. Thank you. Anyone else?
This is Bridget. In the first egocentric, it seemed to me what the person's getting is safety.
Mm,
And then the second ethnocentric is belonging.
belonging.
Yeah, and then the world centric is, I think, a larger sense of belonging,
Mhm.
like belonging to a bigger group, you know, and there are probably some sort of power with that. And then, you know, the cosmocentric is, it's funny because I ended up just going with belonging in a way, but just belonging to everything and everything belonging to that sense of transcendence of the, I'm a part of everything and everything is a part of me.
Mhm.
So it's funny, like I started out with basic safety for ethnocentric stage, but just kind of went to a sense of belonging for the different kinds of belonging for the following three.
Yeah. Interesting. I don't think I said belonging, but that's of course that's a universal human need. So it makes perfect sense.
I kind of have a comment on the cosmocentric. I don't know if this is applicable, but this is what popped into my head. So I've been studying reading astrological charts with an astrologer for the past year and a half. And when I had to go back to work after the shutdown, you know, every time we would meet, he kept wanting to base our meetings on the way that the stars aligned. And I finally had to say to him, you know, Don, I have a schedule now. I can't base my entire schedule on, you know, what's going on with the planets and the stars. So we need to kind of make a time that we can meet, you know, that's kind of consistent. So that's what I thought. That's what popped into my head when we were talking about, when you were talking about cosmocentric.
Interesting. astrology. I wouldn't have gone there. I wouldn't have thought to drag that in, but that's an interesting perspective. Thanks for sharing.
I I had a comment. I was thinking, and I'm gonna kind of nerd out a little bit, but with Lord of the Rings, you can kind of find all of this, each of these steps within it, right? So you have Smeagol, who would be, or Gollum, who would be very egocentric, right? He wants his needs. He wants that ring. That's all he thinks about. And then you have the hobbits, who they stay in their shire. They don't go past that border. There's even a part in the movie where they're like, this is the farthest I've ever gone. And they're at that border. And then they go and move. They move from ethnocentric to world-centric, because then they're thrust into this journey of, I need to help all the other folks. We need to come together and we have to save the world. And then you have Gandalf, who goes from being world-centric to then coming back and realizing there is a deeper need, and he is going from world-centric to cosmic-centric and realizing that the need is deeper than just the world. There are more factors at play. There is that connectedness that was at the world-centric, but it is now a greater connectedness. And that's what I thought was a really neat thought to share.
That is absolutely fascinating. I'm not huge into Lord of the Rings, so I don't know if I would have put that together. But thank you for sharing. And I think that, for those of you that have seen Lord of the Rings, I think that's a beautiful analogy, like a great way to explain this stuff.
Yeah, that was awesome, John. Thank you for that.
Thank you.
Anyone else before we move on?
I know for me, one thing that just kept coming up also was Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And I felt like egocentric, someone who's preservational and is clinging to, or maybe feels that their baser needs are threatened on some level. Ethnocentric, probably more of your needs are met, and maybe world-centric gets to a degree of esteem, maybe bordering on self-actualization. But to your point, Daniel, I thought your insight about maybe losing context or empathy for lower rungs on the hierarchy of needs come in as like the blind spot there, where I think of world leaders who you build these massive societies to distribute resources to people who maybe wouldn't have easy access to resources, but maybe they're blind to the fact that there's still people who don't have resources, because they're so bought in on the means of the functions of society and not the actual day-to-day reality of some folks, right? And then cosmocentric, I would term as self-actualization on the hierarchy needs, like the transcendence of need, basically. That just kept coming up. Basically just a theme of fear and clinging on, but justifiable fear and clinging because your needs aren't being met on egocentric, right? Up through a degree of transcendence from need. Once you get to cosmocentric.
Yeah. Well, thanks for sharing. Is this Sean? I'm sorry, I can't see.
Yeah, it is. It is. Yeah.
Thought I recognized your voice. Yeah, thanks for sharing. I think this is a huge blind spot for every stage, is forgetting the context, losing context of where other people are at. Especially the more that the gap grows. If there's some Amazon tribes at stage purple and we're all the way up here at yellow trying to solve integral problems, it's like we can leave people behind or underestimate the things that other people are valuing, or what they're capable of. So Joe?
So I was thinking about the idea of continuum that's helpful for me. I like your idea that.
Can you say, what do you say more?
I'm sorry.
Can you say more about what do you mean by continuum?
Yeah, so I wonder, when we are talking about stages, if we have a tendency to think of them as like climbing a ladder, going higher and higher.
Mhm.
So then, to your point, the idea that one might be more developed or less developed. And I wonder, I just always wonder if that isn't potentially a trap for us to think of higher or lower rather than we have more, we're moving this way rather than this way. When we're talking about any kind of stages of development.
Okay, that was a complicated comment. Let me see if I can unpack it.
All right,
Can I just piggyback on that really quick? So yeah, I see what you're saying, Joe, like rather than it kind of mapping it out on a linear kind of way, when you're talking about continuum, like spectrum, and then what brought to mind for me was like kind of concentric circles, right? So we
Exactly.
start somewhere
Yeah.
and then we're constantly growing out, and each new level kind of incorporates and integrates everything
Right,
else. It's not just like you're here or you're here or you're here.
right,
Right.
yeah.
Yeah, and also just to add on what Joe was saying, when I thought of these different people, they were all aspects of my own self.
Mm,
My egocentric self, my ethnocentric self, my world-centric self, and cosmocentric self, that I'm constantly going in and out of these different perspectives and the way I interact with the world.
interesting. So okay, 3 people gave comments, but I'm gonna attempt to repeat it back and see if I got it right. But I think what you're saying is that perhaps a different view on these progressive stages could be taken, where they're more like each one of these stages is actually kind of like its own line of development that could be happening simultaneously, kind of like your musical intelligence versus your mathematical intelligence. Like they're not, you don't evolve from math to music, but you can have a different level of awareness on both of those scales. Is that kind of what you're saying? Or am I totally misreading that? I guess Joe, she kind of seeded this conversation, but
Yes, perhaps, maybe, you're the idea of a spiral, which is where you started,
Mhm.
I think is informative to me, rather than laying something flat in a linear way.
I see.
Do you know, or even in, to Melinda's point, the concentric circles, I think, I just think that I think a shadow of developmental theory is that it can become boxy and linear.
Mhm.
I think there's value because we're trying to give language to an experience, but I think that's the shadow of it. Does that make sense?
That does make sense. I see now what you mean by continuum in that this process of development, just you don't just wake up one day and you're not egocentric anymore. You're constantly kind of on a spinning wheel, developing your skills and ideally getting to somewhere better than where you were, but being able to take more perspectives. It's funny, the original Spiral Dynamics on the cover of the book, which I have it around here somewhere, but it is kind of this, they use the rainbow colors, but it's like this beautiful, like upward spiraling. I'll see if I can pull it up at the end, but it definitely implies a cycle of development instead of a progression along a linear track. So.
Just one other thing. We have a place in Jungian work that is worrisome to some people, and that was the linguistic of tribal and primitive, and that is seen negatively
Mm.
as sort of condescending or pejorative or demeaning to some people. And that certainly was not in any way the intention, but I think it's an example of ethnocentrism.
Certainly, certainly. Yeah, it might be good to know that, whoever came up with these theories was perhaps at one of these stages. They had a perspective as well, and it's not the ultimate perspective. And so things sneak in, like calling these lower stages primitive. Perhaps that is offensive, right? I'm not sure if tribal is offensive. I don't know if that offends anyone, but I mean, my main point here is that every single person on this planet is at the developmental stage that they're at for a reason, and it's okay. Aside from the connotation of the labels, I think there's something very real and very useful here.
I agree.
Yeah, you bring up a good point. And I know, John, you've had your hand up forever. Go ahead.
Well, I was just going to comment on Joe brings up a good point. And there's a different way we could look at this, possibly the way Ken Wilber and John Gebser to a certain extent, but especially Ken Wilber. You're right, on the screen, it looks like the development is going from left to right. But for example, Ken Wilber talks about, and I used to be a Ken Wilber fanatic, but now I see a lot of, I see it from a different perspective, let's put it that way. But I think he was right on a number of things. And so instead of, for example, on the screen, the egocentric, ethnocentric, world-centric, these are going linearly, but if I understand it correctly, Ken Wilber would say these are not stages of development, they're structures of development. And so they would go egocentric, ethnocentric, world-centric. These are stages, structures, like you were saying earlier, Daniel. One structure can't really understand another structure, especially one above it. And if you try to reason with a structure below you, they're not going to understand or agree with what you're saying, because their thought process is different in one structure from another. Now, the stages are linear, so you can have stages of development in each structure that is linear. You can have very undeveloped, let's just take ethnocentric for an example. You can have very primitive, undeveloped individuals or groups in the ethnocentric, but then you can also have much more highly developed individuals or groups in that same structure, but they would be at a different stage of development. So if that makes any sense, there are the structures, but then within each structure, there's a stage that is linear. So
Good.
that's
Yeah.
the way Ken Wilber and some of the others explain it. And then let me make one other really quick comment.
Go ahead.
About your introduction that I found interesting when you were introducing yourself about your past. It's like I had a similar situation probably 40 years before yours, in that Alan Watts was a big influence on me. I went to college and high school and was sort of raised in Fort Worth, Texas. And I came upon his book called The Book, is just the name of it. And the subtitle is The Taboo Against Knowing Who You Are. And I found that a really interesting book. And then I moved out to San Francisco. And this was in 1970. And I was living in San Francisco, and Alan Watts was living in Sausalito, which is just across the Golden Gate Bridge in Marin County. And Alan Watts, I saw in the newspaper that he was going to give a 3-lecture series over 3 consecutive nights over at in the ballroom at Berkeley University in Oakland, I think it was. So I talked a couple of friends into going with me, and we went to see Alan Watts in person. We made 2 of the 3 nights. And this was just across the Bay Bridge to get to Berkeley. And it was really interesting. He was quite an interesting character and had a good influence on me.
Yeah.
I respected him a lot.
It's incredible. Yes, my inner fanboy is going like this. I'm like, ooh, Alan Watts in person sounds awesome.
Yeah.
Did Anna
Yeah, I think Anna had a hand up.
put it down? But if you want to say something, go ahead,
Okay, I will.
please.
Thank you to all the comments, and thank you, Daniel, for your personal work and your story. I appreciate that a lot, and for this work. Just a couple things, sort of to the point that Joe and some others were making. It's interesting that that painting that William Blake did of Jacob's Ladder, the angels were on a spiral,
Mhm.
and
Helix.
yes, and so that and so that to me is also a part of or just sort of congruent anyway with what was being said, about the idea of I see that too. Basically, we revisit aspects of ourselves, all the time, except I believe that we're always growing one way or the other. A couple of other things. I have seen people really misuse the spiral dynamics in terms of thinking themselves superior because they think they're in the green meme or whatever. And so, whatever. But I mean, people can misuse anything. But I think that has to do with, again, I'm not going to say they're in this stage or the other stage, but it just has to do with that. To me, as I really grow, as I see other people really grow, one naturally incorporates or has love for the other folk or the other, that are at other structures, because that's what it really means to expand your consciousness. So I loved what you did in the meditation, of having us think of a person and then having us imagine, that we are sending that person love or surrounding them in love. I mean, that's to me really what it's all about. And yes, it's helpful, to understand oneself and others for the purpose of having compassion for ourselves and others, okay, you are working out of a different frame here or something. And just the final thing to the point about, I don't know, terminology, but, one thing I think I hope is becoming more obvious to us in the Western world, it's becoming more obvious to me, and I know a lot of people for a long time, is that oftentimes indigenous cultures are highly evolved at the spiritual level, that they're very, I get it, that they're absolutely one with nature and the cosmos, and it's to some degree, again, this can get kind of messed up too, but to some degree, it's been the Western rational mind that has disconnected us in consciousness from the cosmos. So when I'm familiar with these ideas and with Kohlberg and all of that, and it's important for me to really think about what does it, take the aspects of Western rational thinking, which are of great value, and to have the humility to get it, that in that process, I'm certainly part of Western culture, Western Euro culture, is that that there was some stuff that we forfeited. And for me, it matters to reclaim that. And to me, that's a lot of what Jung was doing, in his own time, as he was reclaiming the whole concept of archetypes. I mean, where did he get that? He got that from indigenous people. So that matters to me when thinking about this, to also understand how to integrate Western rational thought with indigenous cosmic thinking. Thank you.
Yeah, that's a brilliant point, and I took some notes. I'll have to think about that, but I appreciate you inputting that. Should we continue? Okay, almost there, folks. What time is it? It's about 8:15. Okay, so we're gonna move on. Speaking of cycles, you guys must have intuitively remote viewed my slides or something. So we're going to now move on to a more cyclical model, which is basically, this is kind of Jung's model, or Joseph Campbell, the hero's journey. This is another important diagram or understanding of the way that people develop. And the one thing I'm going to say about Jung, and Joseph Campbell as well, but Jung's way of thinking about this stuff is more, I'm going to call it more romantic. And so this is not this kind of structural stage model with discrete stages. This hero's journey, this model of development, is more like, it's more like a drama. It's more like a theater of action where you have to go out and act, and you interact with characters. You interact with significant characters in the story along the way. So this, you know, I forget, was it Sean who was talking about Lord of the Rings? Pay attention. Maybe you can help us connect the dots with the hero's journey. But you can see that the hero's journey starts with this person just exists in the ordinary world. There's a call to adventure. They might refuse the call. There's some supernatural aid. You know, all of this is in the departure stage. So the hero goes out into the chaos, into the unknown, into the foreign territory, or in this case, the belly of the whale, right? The worst, scary place that no one wants to be, in the belly of a giant fish in the bottom of the ocean, right? You guys remember Jonah and the whale, swallowed by a whale? So this is like a direct mapping onto that. What else? Pinocchio, right? His father is swallowed by a whale, and he has to go down to the bottom of the ocean to rescue him. Like, what does that even mean? Why is this a children's story? It's the hero's journey in symbolic, you know, in artistic representation. Okay, so the hero departs on an adventure. They have to go through some kind of ritual. They have to get initiated. They have to have some kind of awakening experience. And then eventually they return. So you return to the kingdom, you return to the family, you return home. But of course, you have grown. So you return home, but you aren't exactly the same as when you left. So that would kind of imply that we're, you know, if we're looking at this from the top down, it looks like a circle. The hero is departing, they're learning, they're becoming initiated, and they return. But if you look at it sideways, it looks like they're spiraling in a particular direction. So after you've completed one full circle, you're not exactly where you started. So I think this is a very interesting model, and perhaps we could kind of take this circle and, you know, splice it orthogonally into the stages and say at each stage, a hero's journey takes place. And by the time you return, you're at a different level, or, you know, you've learned something and progressed. So this is fascinating. And Jung was deeply influenced by religion, mythology, fairy tales, studying alchemical manuscripts, symbolic drawings, you know, all kinds of esoteric imagery. And he tried to figure out what's the underlying pattern in these stories. And so the hero's journey is kind of an abstract representation of the important parts of these mythological stories. In fact, we kind of just finished a class a couple of months ago. Melinda was the primary teacher, but we analyzed a fairy tale from this book called Women Who Run with the Wolves. It was just one chapter of the book discussing one fairy tale, but we went through every one of these stages and talked about the processes and the kinds of things that happen at each stage. So this is, it seems kind of mythic or mystical, but this is a fairly well-studied diagram or process. So this is pretty interesting. Let's continue. So I just finished reading volume 9-2 of Jung's collected works. It's called Ion. I don't know if Jason's here. I just finished reading it with Jason. I don't recommend it. It was painful to read that book, but he presents a model of development, which I'm just calling Journey to the Self. He didn't give it a title, but basically, if you go through Jungian therapy or a wisdom tradition like this, you're going to be exposed to some psychological facts about yourself that most people are not aware of. And these are the four main things you're going to encounter. And like I said, Jung's approach is more romantic. It's more like a hero's journey than it is a progress through, discrete stages. So when the hero goes on his journey, or when you're taking a journey to yourself and you're doing Jungian analysis, the first fact that you're going to be confronted with is your own ego. And this is basically using Freud and Jung's definition of the ego, which is the center of the field of the subjective center of consciousness. It's the thing that we think that we are. So everyone has this. If you're sitting here right now and you're thinking that you are in a particular place or time, I'm sitting here in a chair, sitting in front of a Zoom screen. I have certain belief systems. I'm hungry, right? This kind of self-referential, all the things that we know about ourselves, this would be considered contents of the ego. When we get to these later encounters, things start to get a little more interesting. I assume everyone here who's reasonably educated probably knows what I mean by ego. Is that a fair assumption? Or should I say more about it? Maybe we could do a little compare and contrast here, because Jung was a student of Freud, and Freud's view of the unconscious was basically that everything that you weren't conscious of was kind of, it was like a wild beast. It was like this untamed, loose, fiery kind of wild energy, and it came out in instincts and drives. And I think we can all probably common sense see this perspective, because Freud has been such an influential thinker. Jung's view was a little different. So instead of that there's a wild monster inside of your head that's out of control and needs to be beaten and tamed and brought into submission, Jung had a little bit more subtle view, and it was more like that your mind is inhabited by sub-personalities or souls or something like that. And where you're at first, when you first start to develop, you're not, he would say you're unintegrated. All these different pieces of you have not been brought into alignment. And I think this is actually pretty easy to recognize, because everyone's had this moment when they've said something and then later, said something when they were angry or enraged, and later they thought to themselves, I would never say a thing like that. I would never do something like that. Okay, but you did. So then there's like this split between two parts of your brain. Like one part wants to go downtown and get in a fight, and the other one wants to, be peaceful. And okay, so what's going on here? Jung's view was that there are parts of your mind that are kind of always competing for your conscious attention, competing to control your motor circuits. And depending on your mood, depending on what time of day, different parts of your mind are in control. So it's better to think about these as sub-personalities that are always bidding for control of your mind. The one that has control most of the time for most people is the ego. It's the strongest one. It's the most well-developed one. But the one right underneath that is the shadow. And I think we can all at least have some recognition that we have a shadow. Because of the example that I just gave, we sometimes we do things that we don't think we would do, and then when we look at it, we find out the motivations for doing that thing were perhaps a little sinister, perhaps not what we would have thought our motivations would be. So this can be eye-opening, and this is kind of the first stage into the depths in the Jungian model, is confronting the shadow. The two later ones, the syzygy, the anima animus, is what Jung's term for the soul. Anima in Latin means soul. So syzygy means soul. So after you've recognized your shadow and you start to study that very closely, you study the parts of your personality that are subterranean, uncivilized, not very nice, right? Perhaps prone to outbursts, or they're not under the control of your ego. If you start studying this content for long enough, you'll find out that there's something even deeper than the shadow. There's something even deeper, and that's the anima, or the animus. And this is what Jung would call the soul. Now, if you're a Christian, you might not agree with that, but Jung kind of psychologized this concept of the soul and made it more into a psychological aspect of our personality, instead of this eternally undying force that was external to us or not connected to our physical body. And then even deeper than the soul is the self, the deep self, or the higher self. The deep self and the higher self are the same thing, but the metaphor for deeper and higher are kind of interchangeable here. But the self is like your entire total personality. And Jung would say you can't actually be fully conscious of this, but if you study the ego, and then you study the shadow, and then you study the anima animus, you can kind of deduce that something must be pulling the strings, and we're going to call that the self. So again, I think the important message here is to treat it as a hypothesis, but ask the question, is everything going on in my head under my control? And I am 100% certain, if you look closely, the answer is no. You're not conscious of everything that's going on in your head. You're not in control. And it is absolutely terrifying, but in the Jungian view, this is kind of a necessary step to take, to recognize that we're not in full control, and then to start to look at these other pieces of our personality that are outside of our control, and basically see what we can do. Can we negotiate with them? Can we retrain those parts of our mind? What can we do? But recognizing it thoroughly is the first step. Yeah, and if you want to know a ridiculous amount of detail about this topic, you should read Ion. But I'll just give you the synopsis sometime. I'll spare you. Let's move on. How are we doing? 8:30. Well, this one's good. Just have a couple quotes for you. I thought the shadow is one of the most important teachings of Jung. One of the things I started to hear from Alan Watts about Jung before I'd even read Jung, but just this recognition of shadow. And I think these two quotes, one from Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who was a prisoner in a gulag in Soviet Russia. I want to say he spent like 12 years or so in a concentration camp, and he was a devout communist. He was an intellectual in Russia, and as soon as the intellectuals were done playing their part with the communist revolution, the Soviets started locking up the intellectuals. So he was thrown in prison and had 12 years to think about existential problems, like, how did I get myself into this mess? So that's actually a fascinating read if you're interested in an existential a look into evil and the shadow. So fascinating. And then, of course, Jung's quote here: the most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely. And this is why people don't look at the shadow, which is why it's the shadow, is because we don't want to accept it. We want to ignore it for as long as possible. Let's see, how are we doing on time? Okay, we're gonna do an exercise. We're gonna do it quickly because we have to stop by 8:50. We have a minute to talk. But we're gonna do, this is a bit of a tangent, but it's very, very useful in terms of uncovering shadow elements. So it seems like a little bit of a non sequitur, but once we're finished, I think you'll see that it is in fact not. It's very relevant. But before I switch the slide, I will say that Jung's perspective on kind of shadow work, recognizing your shadow and anima animus, is that it is next to impossible to do it by yourself. In other words, you won't ever get it through meditating. You can't recognize your shadow if you're just sitting there in a quiet room. You actually need another person. And the reason is that other people have this uncanny capacity of triggering us. So it's way easier to recognize the shadow when it's kind of projected, when we start to get into an argument or a scuffle with another person. So we're going to do this quick exercise, and that is probably all the time that we're going to have. If you guys have a piece of paper handy, that would be excellent. Paper and pencil. And we're actually going to write down, if we can't, you don't have to, but I highly recommend it. We're going to write down the answers to the questions. It's just like a little journaling exercise. And that's because the mind is very tricky. And if we're just reading the questions and answering them in our head, we have a proclivity to forget, ignore, misinterpret. It's actually quite funny how tricky our mind can be. We study this stuff. The unconscious it's a tricky beast. Okay, so we're going to do this exercise I learned from a brilliant coach in Salt Lake City. All these questions start with, like I said, they're going to start by working on something that bothers us with other people. And this is how we're going to kind of start to get some leverage and access some shadow stuff, some shadow elements. Hopefully everyone can see this, but these 6 questions kind of all revolve around one idea. So what I want you to do is pick a specific moment in time where someone else was really, really bothering you. They were making you really angry. They were getting under your skin. You just, nails on a chalkboard. You just couldn't stand whatever that person was doing. Now I want you to kind of think of that memory, clarify it, bring it to mind, imagine that you're there now, and then begin to answer these 6 questions.
I think we had something in the chat earlier, Daniel, that not everyone can see the writing on the screen, so you might need to talk us through these.
Oh, my apologies. Okay, I will absolutely do that. Also checking the room. Okay. So the first question says, in this situation, who angers, confuses, hurts, saddens, or disappoints you, and why? And then there's it's kind of a fill in the blank, but it says, I am blank. I am feeling a certain way with a certain person because why? So I am blank with blank because blank. Let me give you an example. I am angry with Paul because he lied to me. That's the example. So we're just thinking of a situation that made you really angry, confused, sad, hurt, disappointed. And it's okay if your anger or disappointment seems irrational. Like if you're thinking to yourself like, well, maybe I shouldn't have been mad at that person, but you were. So that's, that's okay. No judgment here. Again, everyone's mind is exactly where their mind is, and that's okay. You're at whatever place you're at, wherever you are on the hero's journey. You are allowed to be there. None of us will judge you. Okay, question 2 is about wants, and it says, in this situation, how do you want this person to change? Or another way of saying it is, what do you want them to do? And the example is, I want Paul to see that he is wrong. I want him to stop lying. So you can say, I want whoever this person is to do what? What do you want them to do? Which, by the way, most of us haven't thought through. We know we're angry, but we don't know what we wanted them to do. We know that they did it wrong. And that's interesting in itself, right? Maybe we're angry because we don't know what we want, but that's okay. In this situation, how do you want this other person to change? I wanted them to greet me when they came home from work, or I wanted them to come to my talk, but they didn't want to. Whatever it is. Again, it's okay if it's petty or if they couldn't do it, won't do it, shouldn't do it, but you wanted them to do it, so that's okay. We're just taking our own kind of first person perspective here. Treating our own emotions and our psychological state as present and real. We're not spinning a fiction, but just however we feel. And question 3 is, in this situation, what advice would you offer? And it's phrased like, this person should or should not fill in the blank. So the example is, Paul shouldn't frighten me with his behavior, or Paul should take a deep breath before he starts talking. Okay, so some advice, like what this person should or shouldn't do going forward. And then the 4th question is about needs. So in order for you to be happy or to have been happy in this situation, what would you need this other person to think, say, feel, or do? And the example is, I need Paul to stop interrupting me, or I need him to listen to me. This is a need-based question, but I need this person to fill in the blank. And give you a second. Is everyone keeping up the pace? Is that okay? Okay, so the 5th question is, what do you think? What's your honest judgment of this person in that situation? So in this one, you could make a list. You can use all get creative here. How does your shadow self, the part of you that maybe you wouldn't admit it out loud, you don't want to say it, but what did you really think of this person? They're petty, arrogant, dishonest, complete asshole, whatever. It's no, if there was no filter, what were you thinking of this person? I'm not going to force anyone to read these, so don't worry. I won't be calling on people. By the way, if you're kind of struggling with that question of like, well, deep down, I feel one way, but I don't even really want to have that thought come out. That's an indication of like shadow contents, basically. Is like, well, at the deepest level, I hated this person. I wanted to punch him in the face, but on the surface, I'm like, oh, everything's fine. Okay. So, but what did you really think in that situation? Remember, we're kind of going back to that anchor situation where someone was making us very angry or frustrated. Okay, and then the last question is, What is it about this person or situation that you never want to experience again? The example is, I don't want Paul to ever lie to me again, or I don't ever want to be disrespected. So you can start the sentence with, I don't ever want fill in the blank. If you're like me, the first part, these first 6 questions, quite easy to fill out, actually. It's really easy to judge other people. Almost effortless, right? Mhm. But now we're going to get into the real work. So we're going to, now that we have honestly answered the questions to the best of our ability, we are actually going to get on our thinking caps, right? We had our emotional cap, kind of our emotional gut reaction to these questions, but now we're going to think about them. I want you to, let's see, pick one of these questions that you thought, in this situation that you've been imagining and reviewing in your head. Pick which one you think resonates the most, or made you, maybe the one that you were able to answer the quickest. You're like, yes, I know exactly the answer to this question, or whichever one you think might need the most work on. One you think you might be most fruitful. The one that most accurately expresses the the real nature of how you felt at that time. And we're going to start questioning this statement. So let's see, maybe I'll use question 1 as an example. But the first question that we're going to, oh wait, so does everyone have, they've picked their favorite or their most important statement? And now we're going to, you could write this down next to it or something, but we're going to ask 4 questions about, you do it for every statement, but we're just going to do it for 1 right now. So picking your favorite statement, ask yourself, and this is like a deep question, but is it true? And sometimes that's enough. Sometimes we just start laughing. Of course, it's not true. And the point is not to necessarily conclude definitively 100% if the thing is true or false, but by asking, is it true? I'm also asking, in what ways is it false? And then if that's not quite enough, the second question is, can you absolutely know beyond a reasonable doubt? Can you be 100% certain that this thing is true? Including everything you know about psychology and human nature. Well, you want someone not to tell you a lie. Or people shouldn't lie. Is that true? Maybe on a relative level it's true, and maybe on another level people lie all the time, and that's what people do. So can you absolutely know that this thing is true? And again, we're kind of also asking in what way is this false? In what way is our answer perhaps kind of true at the relative level, but not absolutely true? You're like, okay, within a reasonable, trusting relationship, people shouldn't lie, but people shouldn't lie absolutely. Well, maybe that's not absolutely true. I don't know. The third question this is kind of a personal reflection, but how do you react, or what happens to you inside your head when you believe this thought? Paul shouldn't lie to me. How does that make me feel? Well, it makes me feel violated. It makes me feel hopeless because I can't control other people's behavior. It makes me feel lost. It makes me feel disconnected, right? If you've gone down the rabbit hole and indulged your emotional reaction, how does that work? How's that going? What happens when you believe that thought? Other versions of that question could be, how do you treat yourself when you believe this? Or how do you see yourself when you believe this thought? How do you treat the other person? Treat him like a dirty scoundrel because he lied. He did the one thing that you didn't want him to do. So how do you react? The hint here is that sometimes other people's immoral behavior gives us the exact excuse we need to do something equally as bad. So great, we get to level the playing field. Now I can attack, right? So how do you react when you believe this thought? Fourth question is almost the opposite of how do you react when you believe it, is who would you be if you didn't believe it? Or what would you be without this thought? Going back all the way to that kind of anchor memory that we said at the beginning and picturing it, and then just asking that question very lightly. How would this scenario have turned out if this belief, people shouldn't lie or whatever it is, just never occurred to you? So how would this scenario have turned out? How would you see this person? How would things be different if you never, ever even thought this thing? Decide. I think that's actually about all the time that we have. I do want to give a couple minutes for some closing remarks. Didn't even get to talk about meditation very much, did we? Mostly individuation. However, these 4 questions can be very powerful kind of cognitive meditation questions. And you can use this worksheet. I can send it to you. I've done this dozens of times. Whenever I'm kind of feeling stuck, or whenever I'm, feeling anger or some kind of negative emotion towards another person, I love to use this worksheet and these 4 questions. Is it true? Is it really true? Sometimes it's not. Okay, so I will stop there. I'm going to stop screen sharing, and I would love to, if anyone has comments, let's keep it as brief as possible, because we have some announcements at the very end of the meeting. But 2 or 3 minutes, for the next 2 or 3 minutes, if anyone has a very short comment, I'd love to hear it. How did that last exercise hit you, or anything? Sandy?
Yeah, I was struck by how much magical thinking goes into this. you know, that this person would magically know how I feel or would magically be able to do these things or
Yeah.
Yeah.
That is one of the cool things that we can learn from this. Is like, well, did you ever tell them what you actually wanted, or you're just mad that you didn't get that thing that you never even knew? Okay. Yeah. Thanks for sharing, Sandy. And the magical thinking is, yeah. I like that a lot. It's very present. Everyone does it, right? Anyone else before we close it up? I know it's about 8:50, so. Let's see. Did Melinda say something in the chat?
I was just saying that the exercise you just took us through is based on the work of Byron Katie, if people want to explore that further.
Yeah, I should have said that. She's a rather well-known name in the the psychology coaching world. She has a book called Loving What Is, she walks you through some actual examples of working with clients on those questions and the answers that they provide and the coaching process behind that's really incredible. And if you are able to get a hold of the audiobook, even better, because it's actually a recording of her at a conference working with these people. Yeah, incredible stuff. Just asking, is it true, can be a very powerful question. Okay, so my time here is basically done. I'm very thankful to have had this opportunity. Oh, maybe I just need to show you the last slide because I have a couple things. Let's see. And then I will turn it back over to, I guess, Melinda. But just wanted to show you guys a couple things coming up. I have a Monday evening meditation class every Monday at 7:30 on Zoom. If you're interested in learning more about meditation, I would love to see you guys. Melinda and I have a coaching skills for authentic relationships class beginning on February 23rd. It's going to be an 8-week class. We're going to talk about some really cool coaching skills. We taught this class this year in 2021 with some really great feedback. So I'm excited to teach it for the second time. And then our Reset and Rejuvenate Weekend Hill Country Retreat is going to be the weekend of April 22nd through the 24th. And so if anyone's interested in that, all three of these options, you should get on my mailing list. And if you want to do that, just put your email in the chat and I would be happy to connect you up. I will, I won't spam you or anything. I only send out emails occasionally for specific reasons, for specific events. So I hope to see some of you soon, but if not, thank you, because this was a great audience. I got some really good questions, some good feedback, and some more questions for me to research. So thank you guys.
Thank you, Daniel. And wanted to let you all know about our next Jung Society event next month in November 19th. And actually our speaker is here with us today. So not to put you on the spot, Stephanie, but would you like to say a few words about your presentation next month?
Well, first of all, Daniel, thank you so much. This was incredible. And I really, really enjoyed the contemplations and the expansion of awareness. And the movement. So thank you for this evening. And the space, I think the discussion was fascinating. So thank you all. Yeah. So I mean, my guiding question for my talk is really dealing with uncertainty. And in the spectrum that was introduced this evening, I am specifically in the mythic space as a mythologist, and I'm looking at imagery from the Christian apocalypse and from alchemical imagery, and just seeing what that says about sitting in the space of in between. So.
Wonderful. So Stephanie's talk will be called Drinking from the Chalice, and that's coming up on Friday, November 19th at 7 p.m. So we hope you'll join us for that. And you can find more information on the Jung Society of Austin website, as well as a registration link. So Joe, Sandy, any other announcements? Well,
No,
then,
but thank you, Daniel, for tonight. It was wonderful, really helpful and informative and provocative and exciting. Thanks for being here.
Good, good. Thank you. All very gracious comments. I really appreciate it.
we do have just a couple minutes left, so if there were any other questions, we might be able to take a couple.
I hope that's a good sign that there aren't any. We go either way.
It all made sense, Daniel.
All perfectly enlightened now, so that's good. Go class. Well, thank you guys for coming. It's nice.
That was awesome. Thank you.
We did have a request. Again, some people were having trouble reading what was on the screen, so they were asking if you might be willing to share the PowerPoint. Daniel, and it looks like in the chat, some people are leaving their email addresses, so that could be a way to share the PowerPoint, including the exercises and the worksheet we went through. So it looks like people are leaving email addresses for mailing list, as well as perhaps to receive the PowerPoint if you're willing and able to share it.
Yeah, I just want to maybe sort out. I know 3 people said they want to get on the mailing list, but maybe if you don't, but you only want the PowerPoint, just let me know, and I'll email you the PowerPoint, but not put you on the extended, on the continuous mailing list. So.
Great. Well, thank you all so much. It's lovely to see you and spend the evening with you. And we wish you a wonderful weekend and hope to see you right back here on Zoom in November with Stephanie. Yes.
Yeah, thanks for sharing, Stephanie. That actually sounds like a great talk. Looking forward to it.
Good night, everyone.
This was wonderful. Thank you all again.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, Daniel.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Thank
Bye.
you.